Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world soaked in mud, superstition, and manure, where the line between necessity and absurdity is thinner than your average haystack needle. You're standing ankle deep in a churned up medieval field. The year is 1347, and a soft drizzle makes your already miserable tunic cling to places you'd rather not mention. Your only real companion? A broad-eyed, slow-blinking cow named Milda, whose warm breath is the closest thing you felt to affection in weeks. Welcome to the life of a medieval farmer, where plagues roam, lords extort, food disappears, and strange choices, like marrying your livestock, suddenly make a bizarre kind of sense. You probably won't survive this century, let's be honest. Between famines, peasant revolts, and that nasty rat-born thing creeping west, your odds are worse than a goose on Michaelmas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the same patch of land your grandfather once tilled, barefoot in summer, blistered in winter, and cursed by every tax collector who's ever smelled a turnip. Land is life, and land is not yours. It belongs to some lord with too many vowels in his name, and he's never seen a field that didn't involve falcons and wine. Still, here you are, trying to keep your tiny straw-roof world spinning. You rise with the crow of a rooster and collapse by firelight. Your day bookmarked by grunts, creaks, and the occasional moo. And the deeper you live in this daily grind, the more your cow becomes everything. Milda isn't just a source of milk. She is warmth in winter, security against starvation, and, if we're being honest, the only creature who listens without judging your pathetic attempt at song. Which brings us to the most peculiar practice you've heard whispered to the hay bales. People have married their cows, not in some symbolic, folklore sort of way, not metaphorically, legally, with witnesses, sometimes even a priest. At first you laugh, then you cough, then you think about it. Because in a world where livestock is the difference between life and death, what better way to lock down your most precious asset? You see, the medieval peasant wasn't stupid. Desperate, yes. Drenched in superstition, absolutely. But not stupid. The people of the 14th century understood something we tend to forget. In times of extreme uncertainty, rituals, even absurd ones, give structure to the chaos. So you start asking questions. You visit old Thomas, whose beer has outlived 3 monarchs and smells faintly of cider. You ask about the farmer 2 villages over, the one with the suspiciously pampered goat, and the stone ring by the well. And Thomas, through a mouthful of toothless chuckles, tells you, "Aye, lad, some folk put a ring on a cow, for they put one on their bride. Safer, innit?" He's not wrong. In some isolated hamlets, the line between economic bonding and literal bonding blurred, until it tied a man to a beast legally. These were communities where the church came once a year, and local law was shaped more by gossip than gospel. And if you swore in front of the right elders, in the right tone, beside the right oak tree, well, congratulations. You're married. The barn is now your chapel. Mainstream historians often sweep these practices aside as exaggeration. Peasant jokes told after too much barley beer. But scattered documents, estate rolls, and dusty legal margins suggest something more than drunken folklore. Livestock, after all, were entered into dowries. Inheritance disputes were fought over which child got which ox. And in rare cases, beasts were named in wills as primary heirs. One particularly odd entry from a manorial record in Gloucestershire lists Agnes, the sole wife, under the same household agreements as married couples, implying that either a pig had become a very lucrative companion or someone in town was deeply misunderstood. There are tales of farmers who, fearing their kin would claim their property upon death, entered union contracts with their animals. In this loophole-riddled world, binding yourself to your cow wasn't just madness, it was medieval estate planning. Fringe scholars argue these rituals also tapped into older pagan beliefs. In pre-Christian fertility rites, animals weren't just companions. They were vessels of sacred power. Marriage in such context wasn't romantic. It was practical magic. Pairing yourself with a fertile animal was meant to encourage the land, the harvest, even your own loins. Sounds weird? Welcome to the past, where the moon controls your crops and sneezing at the wrong time could curse your lineage. Of course, not everyone agreed on what these unions meant. Historians still argue whether these were symbolic gestures, insurance scams, pagan holdovers, or actual, literal marriages. The truth probably lives somewhere between a punchline and a panic response. You're not sure yet what you believe, but something in your chest shifts the next time you pat Milda's flank. You feel her steady heartbeat through your calloused palm and realize she's been more dependable than most people you know. No gossip, no taxes, no sudden plague-induced coughs. As the harvest moon rises, you remember the tale of Old Will, who swore he exchanged vows with his plow horse. They say he whispered secrets into its ears and danced with it in the frost. They say the priest refused to bless it, but the local reeve counted it as a legal partnership anyway. Why? Because it didn't owe taxes on livestock registered under a marriage bond. And you better believe a broke village would take any loophole it could find. You stifle a laugh. But that night, under your leaking thatch roof, you start writing your own version of vows. Not to Milda, not yet, but to the absurdity of surviving another season. You whisper to the rafters, if this cow sees me through another winter, I'll put a ring on it. Tomorrow, you'll visit the old hedge witch 2 fields over. She knows things about rituals. She's stitched more weddings than most vicars. She might just have a charm that binds in both soul and parchment. Outside, Milda shifts in her stall, letting out a long, contented breath. You swear, for just a second. It sounds like a yes. You wake to the sound of hooves sloshing through muck. Milda's already at it, nudging her feed bin with the kind of entitled energy you'd expect from a royal, but without the back taxes. You blink into gray dawn, your breath forming clouds in the chilly air. The world smells like wet straw and old garlic. Outside, the church bell rings 3 times. No one's died. Yet, but today, you're thinking about marriage. Not yours, at least not in the way your neighbors might understand it. You're thinking about all the weird things you've heard, ceremonies, legal documents, and that time old Ralph muttered that even the cow gets communion if the paperwork's good. It's ridiculous, which, of course, means it's probably true. See, here's the thing. In the medieval world, especially the early to high Middle Ages, the church was still figuring out what marriage even meant. The theology was clear enough. Love, fidelity, maybe a saint or 2 watching, but the logistics? Wildly inconsistent. Most marriages weren't held in churches. They were forged in fields in front of trees, ovens, or neighbors who would yell, "I witnessed it," at the right time. You didn't need a priest. You didn't even need rings, though peasants liked to use twine or carved wood when they felt fancy. And here's where it gets spicy. For a lot of the Middle Ages, mutual consent was the only real requirement for a legal union. That's it. They say I take the, boom, married. Whether that D was bipedal or bovine. Well, now you're treading the line between canonical law and cow nonsense. Some parts of Europe embraced this legal vagueness a little too creatively. The church eventually grew uneasy. Marriages were popping up that hadn't been blessed, hadn't been registered, hadn't even been human. There's a rumor, tucked in the annals of ecclesiastical records from the 1100s, that a bishop in what's now Western Germany tried to excommunicate a man's oxen on the grounds of improper matrimonial conduct. It didn't hold, because the ox, shockingly, didn't show up for trial. Of course, that's likely apocryphal. But apocryphal doesn't mean untrue. It just means someone wrote it down with a wink. This blurry legal environment created the perfect loophole. If your land and livestock were constantly at risk, whether from debt, marauding nobles, or your deadbeat cousin, binding them to yourself through marriage wasn't just practical. It was protective. And in rural areas far from diocesan scrutiny, nobody batted an eye. There's one peculiar case recorded in a fragmented manorial roll from 1281, where a farmer named Jory was said to perform the rites of espousal upon his gray mare. That's all the document says. No elaboration. Just a dry note beneath a list of thatched roof taxes. But if you read between the lines, you sense a legal gambit. See if the mare was espoused. She couldn't be seized as an asset in a land dispute. She wasn't property anymore. She was family. And family, according to many common law customs, was protected. It's hard not to chuckle. But then you imagine a man with nothing to his name but a horse and a patch of oats, facing a barren stool with a parchment scroll and a smug grin. In that moment, saying she's my wife is not a joke. It's a last stand. Now, was the church cool with this? Absolutely not. By the late 1100s, church officials began pushing back hard against informal unions. They issued edicts and councils. They passed canons clarifying that marriage was strictly between one man and one woman. Humans, to be clear, and must be officiated by clergy and witnessed. But guess what? Those rules didn't travel well down muddy roads. In isolated farming villages, priests visited maybe once a season, sometimes only to collect tithes. Local customs persisted, and so did the unofficial marriages between people and their livestock, often spoken of in hushed tones or snorted laughter, but occasionally recorded in genuine legal language. Because here's where things get deeply medieval. Law wasn't centralized. It was a messy lattice of overlapping jurisdictions: manorial law, church law, crown law, village traditions, and whatever your neighbor believed because her grandmother saw a vision in a soup pot. And so, even as bishops preached purity and theologians wrote treatises on sacred unions, old Ben down by the stream was probably muttering marriage vows to goat in front of 3 very drunk shepherds. We don't know how many of these cases were satirical versus serious. Historians still argue whether such unions were real legal contracts or village in-jokes pushed too far. But that debate assumes a clear line between satire and sincerity, a luxury you don't have when you're broke, desperate, and clinging to your last heifer. And this isn't just a fringe oddity. In some areas, local courts recognize quasi-legal marriage-style contracts involving animals. Not as romantic parents, obviously, but as symbolic gestures designed to protect ownership. Some even invoke religious language. A few tuck prayers into barn beams or place dried flowers between a beast's horns in the manner of brides. Is it weird? Absolutely. But no more so than contemporary belief that onions cure plague, or that rainbows were divine arrows. In a world ruled by unseen forces, you do what works, or what seems to. And sometimes, what works is dressing your cow in a wreath and saying, "With this trough I thee wed." Now, not everyone approved. In some areas, such behavior was met with mockery or even punishment, though the punishments varied wildly. There's a fragment of a Welsh court record from the 1300s where a man was fined 3 chickens for making a ceremony with his pig. The record doesn't say what kind of ceremony, but, well, your imagination's probably correct. More often, though, the response was passive confusion. Rural officials had bigger problems. Actual crimes, unpaid taxes, missing sheep, and occasional wolves. If a farmer wanted to stand in a moonlit field with a garlanded mule and whisper his vows, well, no one was rushing to stop him. Because here's the deeper truth. These marriages weren't really about love. They were about power. A farmer with a legally bound animal might avoid taxes, protect his assets, or pass down wealth in ways that would otherwise be contested. And more than that, they were about control. You can't control the weather. You can't control your lord's mood, or the price of grain, or whether the next wave of plague will skip your village. But you can control your cow. You can name her your partner, your heir, your shield. You can stand beside her and say, "This is mine and no one else gets to touch it." In a way, it's weirdly romantic. Not in the soft focus, violins playing kind of way, but in the gritty, calloused hand kind of way. A love born from necessity. A bond forged not in passion, but in manure and frost and stubborn will. So tonight, as you tuck yourself beside your sputtering hearth, the story plays again in your head. The man who wed his ox. The woman who gave her sow a veil. The lad who offered a gold coin to a sheep and said, "Be mine, and I'll never let you starve." You used to think it was madness. Now, you're starting to understand. You're mucking the stall when you remember what old Ewan said last market day, between chewing on some highly questionable jerky and swearing at a rooster. "If you don't leave your land to your cow," he grumbled, "someone else will take it, and they won't even moo at your grave." And as strange as it sounds, you knew exactly what he meant. Because in your world, land doesn't just feed you, it defines you. And livestock, they're not just assets. They're inheritance, pension plan, and next of kin all rolled into one slightly damp bundle of hooves and cud. So let's talk about that third and perhaps weirdest reason medieval farmers were marrying their livestock: inheritance. Let's say you're a modest tenant farmer, no surviving sons, and your cousins are vulture-eyed freeloaders waiting for you to drop like an overripe turnip. But your cow, she's seen you through frost, famine, and fleas. You want her to have what you've built, or at least ensure your greedy kin don't get it. In the complex tangle of feudal inheritance law, who got what after you died was often determined by overlapping customs. Primogeniture was favored in noble lines, yes, but peasants lived by other rules. In many regions, especially across England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, usufruct law applied, a system where use rights trumped actual ownership. If you could prove someone or something had long-standing use of land or goods, courts might recognize their claim. Sounds far-fetched? Not if you stretch definitions like taffy at a May Day fair. There's a curious French legal case from 1274 where farmers will name Brunet, his donkey, as a recipient of pasture and dwelling. The donkey, mind you, couldn't read, but a local priest reportedly administered the blessing over the bequests. When the farmer's nephew protested, the court sided with the wording. Brunet had lived on the land for 17 years and was customarily accepted as part of the household. Legally, that carried weight. Now, did the donkey actually take ownership? Of course not. But the legal maneuver froze the land transfer. For years, by the time the nephew regained control, the village had effectively absorbed the property into communal use. And not a copper piece changed hands. Genius, really. And this wasn't just a one-off. Scattered across rural ledgers, you find odd little wills with phrases like, "To my dear heifer Matilda, I bequeath the lower field and the right to water at South Stream." It sounds absurd until you realize that naming livestock as symbolic heirs was a savvy way to lock property into a trust-like status. Not ownership, but custodianship. Historians still argue whether these were genuine expressions of affection or deeply cynical tactics. Some say the affection was real. Others believe it was a method of thumbing one's nose at greedy relatives or local lords who used death as a land grab opportunity. Either way, it worked more often than you'd expect. Let's not forget how closely tied legal identity was to household structure. If your cow shared your roof, worked your field, and even got listed in your manorial tax assessment as house beast of record, then, strangely enough, courts might consider her more kin than cousin. There's a fringe theory that's taken root in some corners of historical academia. Interspecies contracts as proto-wills. That is, agreements made between a human and an animal, often witnessed, written down, and reinforced through ceremony. Modern scholars scoff. But there's something oddly convincing about a small bundle of 14th century pages from a Yorkshire archive where the Latin word sponsa, bride, is scrawled beside the name Elfwin, Cow of Red Ear. Whether it was serious or satirical, the document appears in a book of estate transactions, not poetry. That's the part that makes you squint. Even more intriguing, it wasn't just about keeping your land safe from distant kin. It was sometimes about bypassing the Lord himself. If your livestock inherited your field and the livestock remained in the household, then the land might technically stay out of the Lord's hands for a while. You leave it to your beast and your neighbor or secret lover or illegitimate child could care for the beast. That's the trick. The law might demand you cede land to your overlord when your bloodline ends. But if the bloodline includes a heifer, well, maybe it doesn't end. It was loophole law, legal shape-shifting, a peasant's quiet rebellion dressed up in wool and horns. Of course, this only worked in certain places. Urban centers had stricter oversight, and ecclesiastical courts, once they caught wind of these marriages, made efforts to stamp them out. But out in the rural fog, where the land rolls on and the reeve is also the baker's cousin, let's just say enforcement was a little relaxed. You probably wouldn't find these contracts framed over the hearth, but you'd find them carved into barn doors, tucked into pouches, or whispered during harvest feasts. Ritual replaced parchment when parchment was scarce. Some farmers even held inheritance vigils, where they would speak aloud their wishes beside their favorite cow, under moonlight with neighbors as witnesses, sealing the deal with a symbolic binding. That binding? Sometimes twine, sometimes spit, sometimes, no joke, a shared apple. And what of the livestock? Well, it's not like they understood, but many were treated remarkably well. There's a record from a Danish estate where a pig named Freya, yes, after the Norse goddess, was said to have received yearly oats, apples, and 2 blankets, per her late owner's wish. The steward grumbled, but followed the instructions. People scoff today, but let's be honest, we still name pets in our wills. We still assign trustees to care for them. The medieval farmer just skipped the paperwork and made it sacred. Of course, this created tension. Church officials wrung their hands. Legal scholars scratched their beards. And neighbors gossiped. Did you hear? Someone would whisper over the stew pot. That old Mary left the eastern paddock to a duck? The line between affection and absurdity blurred daily. But in a world where the law rarely protected the poor, these practices weren't irrational. They were practical. A man's ox might pull his plow for 12 years, live in his home, share his bread, and be closer to him than any kin. If you had to entrust your legacy to someone, why not the one who never betrayed you? So tonight, as you lay your head near the fire and listen to Milda's slow, even breathing just beyond the timber wall, you feel a shift. You don't think about her as just livestock anymore. She's been with you through storms and starvation. She watched your neighbor fall to plague, and your sister run off with a tanner's apprentice. She's the only one left who knows all your secrets. And you wonder, quietly, if you pass tomorrow, would the world respect her place? Or would they see her as just meat? You whisper a promise under your breath, soft, silly, half asleep. You'll have the field. I swear it. Let them fight me. And in the stillness of your creaking little home, Milda lets out a gentle low. Sounds like a thank you. You're on your way to the mill when you see it. A procession winding through the next village. Not for a saint's feast, not for a funeral, but for something stranger. At the front walks a man, older, hunched, missing more teeth than a medieval rake has tines, wearing what passes for finery, a too-short tunic with embroidered cuffs and a daisy crown sliding sideways off his balding head. And beside him, adorned with flower garlands and a faintly confused expression, is a cow. You blink. Then, just as quickly, you remember, today's the cow's wedding, and you're late. People are gathering like it's May Day. Bread's being broken. A fiddler is sawing at his strings with abandon, and someone's roasting a chicken on a spit as though this were any other festive gathering. But the mood has an edge, a mix of laughter, tension, and just enough solemnity to suggest that someone's idea of a joke might be someone else's serious legal gambit. Welcome to the world of cow dowries. You shuffle forward with your sack of grain, partly to get a better look, and partly to hear what the reeve is muttering. Aye, he says. She's bringing him a yoke, a cartwheel, and half the oat field. That's more than me wife brought me. And that's the truth of it. In medieval rural economies, livestock wasn't just valued. It was valued more than most humans. Marriages, especially among peasants, were deeply transactional. Romantic ideals had their place, usually in the songs of troubadours and the beds of nobles. But for everyday folk, marriage was about merging resources. And livestock, that was the ultimate dowry. The more beasts you brought to the union, the better your prospects. The old custom of a bride bringing cattle to her husband is well documented. But sometimes the logic reversed. What if your cow was a bride? And that's where things got interesting. Let's take the case of Tom, a real figure from a Lancashire record dated 1326. Tom was poor, debt-ridden, and widowed, with one cow to his name and a plot of land too small to matter. His solution? Wed the cow, and he made a ceremony of it. Local accounts mention flower chains, ale, and the cow being walked around the hearth 3 times. An old fertility rite. What made this remarkable wasn't the pageantry. It was a contract Tom submitted afterward, claiming that by virtue of marriage, his cow now co-owned the property, and that she had brought a dowry of labor and yield. He claimed exemption from seizure by the manor because his wife was still working the land, and for a short time, The Lord Steward accepted it until the cow died. Tom's appeal was tossed out, and he was left with nothing but a reputation and a story that would echo through the fields for years. Still, for a few seasons, he'd held off eviction with nothing more than parchment, parody, and a plucky cow. Mainstream historical sources describe plenty of legal cases involving dowries that listed cows, oxen, or flocks as the dowry itself, a sort of rural prenup. A 1294 charter from Aquitaine lists one brown cow of high yield and calm temperament among the formal items traded in marriage. She was appraised more highly than the bride's shoes, hair comb, and spinning tools combined. But sometimes, the animal wasn't just part of the dowry. Sometimes, it was the one doing the giving, or receiving. There are tales, most scholars roll their eyes, but we're listening anyway, of cows acquiring property through these ceremonies. The animal was dressed, paraded, and symbolically tied to its human groom. A plow or pail would be offered in exchange, and a group of witnesses would toast a union. And here's the kicker. These dowries were often written down. Yes, literacy rates were low, but even the simplest man knew to pay someone to write a contract when land or livestock was involved. Sometimes it was a local priest. Sometimes it was a half-blind clerk who owed his job to a cousin of the reeve. Regardless, contracts were made and names were signed, well, marked with an X, or even a hoof print dipped in charcoal. One fringe tale from Transylvania. No, not that part of it. Describes a farmer who had his pig sign a contract by walking across it. The clerk refused to validate it. The farmer threatened to curse the whole harvest. The document survives, hoof print and all. Now, was all of this technically legal? Not really. But legal in medieval Europe was more suggestion than certainty, especially outside cities. Rural courts prioritized community consensus. If the village accepted the arrangement, then it was law enough. Dowries were deeply symbolic, yes, but they also had real-world consequences. They could determine where land went, who got what during disputes, and what happened when the lord died and the reeve started poking around for taxable goods. And an animal with a marriage contract. That blurred lines enough to make officials pause. Historians still argue whether cow marriages were legitimate unions, legal loopholes, or elaborate jokes with serious side effects. Some suggest they were a way of resisting oppressive tax systems. Others think they were pagan holdovers, reimagined as satire under Christian eyes. But the dowry angle makes things different. It ties these ceremonies not just to belief or rebellion, but to economics. If a man could claim that his cow had entered into a legally recognized partnership, especially one involving property transfer, then he had power. For a while, anyway. There's also the theory that these ceremonies were mockeries of noble excess. Nobles had grand weddings with dowries of castles and fields. The peasant, ever clever, parroted this with a cow and a cartwheel. The whole thing may have been a satirical middle finger to feudal hierarchy, but it had teeth, and that's what matters. You glance again at the cow beside the old man. She doesn't look particularly impressed by the whole affair, but she doesn't seem distressed either. A boy gives her a rub behind the ear. She licks his face. Someone ties a ribbon to her tail. They're taking this seriously, or seriously enough. The couple, if you can call them that, reach the old village stone, the one marked with runes no one can read. There, the steward lifts a jug, says a few slurred words, and declares the bond noted. You raise your eyebrows. Noted is just vague enough to be powerful. Later, you'll hear people argue over whether the land should now pass to the cow if the old man dies. Some say yes. Some laugh. Some say it depends on the witnesses and how sober they were. But all agree that cow's part of the family now. And you're beginning to think Milda deserves a ribbon. The road back from the village is quieter than usual. Even the crows seem unsure how to call after what you've just seen. A cow wedding legal dowry talk, and at least 2 toasts made in total sincerity to the bride's temperament. You're still turning it over in your head when you pass by the old miller's hut and see a crowd gathered just outside. They're not here for flour. At the center of the crowd stands a goat, a very ordinary goat, by the look of her, dust-colored, with a single floppy ear and a kind of stare that suggests she's halfway through planning something mischievous. She's tied loosely to a cart axle, nibbling the hem of a bailiff's robe. And next to her, a boy of no more than 12, pale, wide-eyed, and stammering as two church scribes leaf through parchments and mutter Latin at a pace only matched by a particularly aggressive storm cloud. You stay at the edge of the crowd. You've heard whispers about this case all week. The goat, now infamously named Judith, has been accused of theft trespass, and the part no one says out loud without giggling: unlawful betrothal. Welcome to the trial of the talking goat. Now, if you're asking, why would anyone put goat on trial? Well, welcome to medieval Europe, where legal systems occasionally fell off the back of the cart, and no one bothered to pick them up. In fact, animal trials were more common than you'd think. There are verified cases of pigs being hanged for murder, roosters being burned at the stake for laying eggs, yes, really, and donkeys forced to stand trial for public lewdness, though in one case, both the donkey and the man were found without guilt, and the donkey was praised for her virtue. This happened. We're all processing it together. But goats? Goats were special. They straddled the line between useful animal and supernatural suspect. In folklore, goats were associated with witchcraft, stubbornness, and all things unruly. So when someone claimed a goat had broken into a food storehouse, bleated during a wedding ceremony, and been pledged to a boy in mock union, well, the village council decided to act. What exactly the goat did or didn't do is still a point of confusion. Some say the boy, desperate to distract from his family's unpaid tithe, announced his intent to marry Judith. Others claim he whispered it to the goat, who promptly butted over a candle and nearly set the chapel alight. Either way, here we are. The trial is a hybrid mess of canon law and local custom, officiated by a priest who can barely read and a scribe who takes excessive pleasure in saying hearse and betrothal, like it's something you'll find in a psalter. The goat, for a part, stands silently, chewing cud like a monk listening to confession. But here's the twist. The case isn't really about the goat. It's about property. The boy's father had recently died, and the land he worked, small but fertile, was under dispute. The church wanted it as tithe payment. The boy's uncle wanted it for himself. But the boy, perhaps inspired by stories like Tom of Lancashire and his cartwheel dowry bride, declared his intent to join with Judith and keep the field. As soon as the phrase was uttered, it spread like spilled wine. People thought it was a joke. Then they saw the boy was serious. He even made a little wreath for the goat. He declared her loyal and that she had shared in the household duties, guarding, grazing, keeping spirits at bay, and in a move that historians still can't decide was satire or legal brilliance, he invoked common household partnership, a legal precedent used mostly to recognize shared domestic roles in non-married cohabitants. In other words, he claimed he and Judith had an economic and social union, and that the land, if not passed to him, should pass to her. Cue chaos. Now, this wasn't unheard of. There were earlier cases, murky, half-lost in church records, where animals were named code-dwellers or even members of the household with special rights. Usually it meant they couldn't be seized without due process. But this boy, he was trying to flip the system. The church reacted the only way it knew how, with Latin and a trial. You stand beside the others and listen as they read out the charges. They used phrases like parody of union, mockery of sanctity, and at one point, heretical affection, a term so vague it can mean anything from liking soup too much to declaring love for a goat. The crowd snickers, but the priest isn't laughing. He says something about needing to set a precedent, that people are forgetting what marriage is for, that unions must be honored but not mocked. Then he glares at the goat. Now the goat, to her eternal credit, chooses this moment to bleat, loudly, repeatedly, right as the priest starts his sermon. The boy beams. A woman beside you mutters, "She's doing better than most wives I know." Eventually, the ruling comes down. The goat is found innocent of theft and blasphemy, but the union is declared invalid. The boy is ordered to say 3 Hail Marys, clean the chapel steps, and donate a portion of the field, though notably, not all of it. The court is unwilling to hand everything to the church. Maybe the goat earned some sympathy after all, but the implications? Wild. The idea that a mock union could stall a land claim shook local power. And you start to see why so many farmers had turned to animal marriage, not out of delusion, but out of desperation and genius. Because here's the quiet truth beneath the laughter. These unions were weapons, not of war, but of wit, in a world stacked against you, where nobles hoarded land and church taxes never slept. Turning your goat into a legal entity, even for a day, was a form of resistance. Historians still argue whether such cases were acts of comedy, protest, or both. But you're starting to realize that in the medieval countryside, laughter and rebellion walked hand in hoof. Later that evening, you see the boy walking Judith home. He carries a small loaf under one arm and talks to her softly, like someone confiding in a trusted friend. The field they keep is small, but still theirs, for now. Judith trots beside him, unfazed. Her tail flicks lazily. Her ears twitch. And you wonder, how many other goats, cows, or pigs have carried the legal dreams of peasants on their backs, without ever knowing it? It's the middle of winter when desperation starts to feel like a house guest that overstayed its welcome. Cold, familiar, and impossible to ignore. You haven't seen the sun in 3 days, your stores are low, and the air has that specific bite that tells you even the rats are considering packing it in. Milda stands in the corner of the stall, a gentle, wheezing furnace wrapped in fur. Her ribs show a little more than they used to, and she's producing less milk these days. You can't blame her. You're not doing much better. And that's when you remember what happened the winter your cousin Jaren went strange. Not plague strange, not witch strange. Contract strange. He'd married his cow. Officially, publicly, in the middle of a famine so brutal that people were boiling bark and eating shoe leather. He held a wedding with fresh bread, a single dried apple, and an old priest who seemed far too eager to play along. Most people laughed. Some cursed. A few shook their heads, muttering that hunger does things to a man's mind. But you listened, because Jaren didn't do it for love. He did it for survival. That particular winter, this was 1316, the peak of what became known as the Great Famine, saw crops rot in the fields from endless rain. Roads turned to rivers, and entire villages starved while their lords held feasts behind thick stone walls. Livestock died. Children disappeared. Prices soared. And into that nightmare, Jaren found a loophole. He'd heard from a traveling monk about property bonds, legally binding contracts that allowed peasants to register their animals as domestic partners in co-tenancy. The monk called it a ridiculous notion, but admitted, with a shrug, that it had worked for a few clever rustics in the north. Jaren's interpretation? If he married his cow, then sold her to the local monastery under shared ownership, they'd be legally required to feed and house her, which meant they'd also be feeding him. He made a dowry agreement. The cow brought labor, milk, and the blessing of fertility, his words, not the monastery's. He, in turn, would manage the barn, help with field work, and tend to property. The abbey agreed, mostly because they thought it was funny, but the contract held. That winter, Jaren ate. Others didn't. Historians still argue whether this type of livestock marriage was a loophole or a joke, but even modern legal scholars admit the famine years created legal flexibility no one saw coming. Monasteries were inundated with hungry petitioners, and to manage the flood, they turned to odd little contracts, ones that made animals symbolic co-owners, sacred gifts, or in some very strange cases, spiritual brides. Jaren wasn't the only one. In at least 5 villages across England, surviving manorial roles describe animal vows of obligation, ceremonies where beasts were given religious titles like Sister Cow or Brother Ox. These weren't marriages in the canonical sense, but they used vow-based phrasing common to both monastic life and matrimony, and the result? The animal could be claimed as sacred, and sacred meant untouchable, which also meant fed. Even fringe documents from Eastern Europe record similar tactics. In one Bohemian town, a donkey was ceremonially consecrated as a bride of St. Thomas. The owner was then given weekly grain rations as a beast's caretaker. You can almost see the grin on his face through the brittle parchment. But this wasn't just about food. For many, marrying their livestock during famine wasn't a stunt. It was an act of ultimate prioritization. In desperate times, a cow wasn't just valuable. She was the only thing of value. If you had to choose between feeding yourself or your beast, you'd choose the beast because she kept giving. Milk, warmth, manure for crops. She was a walking pantry, stove, and fertilizer barrel. The idea of letting her starve felt like choosing death over dignity. So farmers got creative. Some marriages were performed in secret, spoken aloud beside a cold fire, witnessed only by the stars and a passing badger. Others were public, grand affairs complete with songs, toasts, and questionable speeches. In one strange 1320 account from Flanders, a man wed his cow with the line, "Where you go, I will go. Where you graze, I will not follow, but I will bring the bucket." Even amid despair, there was humor. But don't let the jokes fool you. These ceremonies had purpose. Some regions began treating married livestock as household wards, exempt from certain taxes or grain tithes. After all, if the beast was part of a sacred or contractual union, you couldn't just seize her like any other property. The law, always a few paces behind reality, grudgingly made space for these rituals. Even the church, despite many loud condemnations, couldn't quite keep up. A frustrated bishop in York once wrote, "We forbid the marriage of man and beast in every form, whether for land, for charity, or for satire. And yet, the cows continue to wear ribbons." You can almost hear the exhaustion in the ink. Of course, not everyone approved. Some villagers saw these unions as deeply blasphemous. Others accused those who practiced them of harboring unnatural affection, a term that would evolve into something far more sinister in later centuries. But during famine, judgment softened. When your children are gaunt, your fields drown, and your only source of warmth has hooves, morality starts to blur. You remember a story from your aunt, the one with the strange laugh and the giant mole shaped like Normandy. She once told you about a man in Brittany who married 2 goats during the Great Hunger. He didn't love them, she said. He just couldn't bear the idea that his cousin, a drunk with a violent temper, would inherit them when he died. So he married them, she snorted, and left them the cheese recipe in his will. You smile at the memory, but your breath catches, because the truth is, you're thinking about doing the same. Milda isn't just a cow. She's the line between survival and collapse. And if marrying her gets you an extra sack of oats, or earns you a little goodwill from Reeve, or keeps her awesome tax list, why not? Not because you believe she's your soulmate, but because you believe in her. And in a world where everyone else seems to vanish when things get hard, that's no small thing. So tonight, you light a stub of candle, tuck your thin blanket tighter, and sketch out a vow. It's short, it's awkward, but it ends with, "For as long as we both shall eat." You laugh, but you don't throw it away. Snow still clings to the thatch like a stubborn curse, and your fingers sting from hauling water, but something about today feels different. You pull your cloak tighter and set off toward the chapel. Not for confession, but because of a rumor that has rolled through the village like an itchy winter cough. There's a record, a real one, tucked somewhere in the Abbey ledgers. Proof that somewhere, somehow, someone married their livestock with papal paperwork. You don't expect much. Abbey records are notoriously dull. Endless lists of barley quantities, and which monk borrowed which candle. But you've also learned not to underestimate the absurdity of old parchment. And besides, the idea is just too strange to ignore. You step into the dusty scriptorium, where Brother Arden is hunched like a mushroom over a stack of crumbling scrolls. He's thin, skittish, and smells faintly of boiled leeks and ink. You clear your throat, looking for any documentation involving livestock unions. He doesn't even blink. More of you. Wait, more? Turns out you're not the first to go digging for signs of animal marriage in official church records. For decades, centuries, even curious monks, bored scribes, and maybe a few legal-minded pranksters have collected scattered references, try and make sense of tradition that exists somewhere between joke, loophole, and desperate prayer. Brother Arden gestures to a stack of vellum, and there, between a dispute over hay tithes and a complaint about improper chicken fasting, is the gem. Concerning the matter of one Beatrix of Clondon, who did enter bond and vow with a milk cow in view of ecclesiastical benefit. It's real. Dated 1238, the document outlines a bizarre yet clearly intentional process. Beatrix, a landless widow, owned a cow named Elin, who was her only source of food and income. In a desperate move to keep her animal exempt from seizure by a local reeve, She applied for spiritual exemption, a type of protection typically granted to monastic property or religious icons. Her strategy? Claiming that she and Elin had entered a bond akin to holy union, through intent of shared sanctity and provision. The church didn't know what to do. After weeks of back and forth between the local parish and the diocese, the matter was escalated to Rome. Yes, Rome. There's no official papal bull, no decree signed in gold leaf ink. But a papal notary did send a curious response, now recorded in the margin of a much larger parchment. Though such union is not a man and woman, neither does it offend the Lord if the creature is held in charity and devotion, so long as none be scandalized. That's not a yes, but it's not a no, and in medieval law, ambiguity is opportunity. This reply gave local parishes a space to handle such cases independently. Some clamped down immediately. Others, especially in the poorer, wetter, colder regions, quietly allowed similar arrangements to continue, so long as no one got too theatrical about it. And that's how you end up with pockets of recorded livestock bonds in dusty monastic libraries, vows whispered beside cows, contracts written with as much Latin as sarcasm, and in at least one case, a pig with a tiny silver cross around its neck, cited in a Flemish codex under the heading Companion in Faith. Brother Arden seems unfazed by all this. He tells you there's a second case, this one from Umbria, Italy. The document is fragmentary, but the meaning is clear. A man named Paolo attempted to enter a spiritual covenant with his donkey, Beppa, during a drought. The donkey had survived 3 wild dog attacks, a landslide, and a mysterious fungal illness that killed every other beast on the property. Paolo believed she was protected by St. Anthony himself and swore a vow of eternal partnership with her in return for continued blessings. The local bishop issued a note of conditional tolerance, stating that what the Lord permits to live, the church shall not swiftly condemn. Historians still argue whether Paolo's actions were devout or delusional, but modern theologians have pointed out that, technically, no major church edict ever directly prohibited marriage to an animal until the 13th century. Before then, the idea was too absurd to legislate, which of course was part of the appeal. You flip through more pages. The patterns begin to emerge. In times of scarcity or crisis, people reach for anything that might stabilize their fragile world. And the church, in its own slow and confused way, tried to accommodate without losing its dignity. Sometimes that meant letting a widow make a charitable vow to her sheep. Sometimes it meant looking the other way when a man claimed his ox was spiritually adopted into the congregation. And once, in the Irish Annals 1156, it meant hosting a ceremony where a donkey received last rites for services rendered in humility. You close the last scroll, your head spinning. Because what you've learned isn't just about loopholes or lunacy. It's about the strange elasticity of sacred language. By using church terminology, vows, bonds, spiritual union, people could manipulate the system, not because they were mocking it, well, not always, but because they were trying to survive within it. You remember Milda's slow, patient gaze, the way she stands with you in the snow without complaint. The way she licks your sleeve when you forget to feed yourself first. And it doesn't seem so strange anymore. Later that night, you kneel by the hearth and think about vows. Not the ones shouted in cathedrals, but the quiet ones between a man and his cow in the still dark when the rest of the world has gone mad. You whisper, for as long as we both shall breathe. And you don't think anyone would mind. By spring, the fields begin to remember how to be green again, and you, in turn, begin to remember how to be hopeful. Milda's back to full milk, her coat gleaming with that smug sheen cows always seem aware when they know you depend on them. Life isn't good, exactly, but it's less bad, and that's worth celebrating. Which brings us to a certain kind of celebration. You get the invitation folded in with your grain sack. Strange, since people around here barely bother to invite you to funerals, let alone ceremonies. But this isn't a wedding or a wake. Or maybe it's both. The note simply reads, "Come before dusk. Bring ale and an open mind. We've a binding to bless." So you go, and what you find is not some ridiculous parody. Not exactly. It's more like, Theater meets ritual meets 3 pints too many. A clearing in the woods, a crude altar built from a wagon plank, and there in the center, a pig in a wreath. The pig snorts. A woman kneels beside it, one hand on its back, the other holding a chunk of barley bread. And around them, half the village, gathered in a kind of reverent hush, as the reeve mutters a speech about shared harvest, mutual burden, and blessings upon this bond. It's one of those rural rituals, the kind you've heard about but never seen with your own eyes. Part superstition, part joke, part dead serious. Welcome to the world of Mudaified vows. In these off-the-record ceremonies, livestock marriage becomes a kind of hybrid thing. Not legal, not sacramental, but symbolically binding, especially within the small rural networks where word of mouth carries more weight than parchment ever could. It's not uncommon. In fact, it's practically a tradition in some places. There's a village in Cornwall where every Midsummer's Eve, a farmer marries his best beast, ceremonially for the year, to bless the harvest. Or the valley in the Black Forest where animals are wed to their barns during lean seasons, binding the household together through a vow to endure. These aren't legal acts. They're acts of belief. And when belief feeds your belly, that's enough. One 13th century Swiss peasant record describes a spring ritual called Die Bindung, or the tying. A beast, usually a cow or goat, would be adorned with flowers and blessed by the eldest woman in the village. Then a vow was spoken. We stand together and work in breath, in burden. Sometimes the farmer said it. Sometimes the animal, standing there with a garland and a shrug, was considered to have said it in her own way. And no one really believed the animal consented in the theological sense. That wasn't the point. It was about making a statement, a claim of unity, of shared fate. Think of it like a vow renewal between species. And not everyone found this charming. Clergy often scowled at such ceremonies. One 1319 sermon from a traveling friar denounced the practice as oxynolatry, which, to be fair, does sound like a disease you catch from licking a yoke. But the villagers kept doing it year after year, even when the bishop threatened fines. Because here's the thing, these rituals worked. Not in the miracle sense, though there were always stories of increased milk or rain following good binding, but in the communal sense. They gave people purpose, order, laughter, even a touch of magic. You watch as the woman beside the pig now stands and offers a toast to warmth in winter, to baconless mornings, to one more year together. The crowd laughs. The pig oinks. Someone hands you ale. And in that moment, you realize you're watching something much older than the law, something pagan in its bones, even if it now wears a Christian coat, a rite of passage, improvised but powerful, a way of saying, this animal is part of me, and I am part of this land. There's a scholarly debate, of course there is, about whether such rituals began as fertility rites or as satire. The answer is probably both. In pre-Christian Europe, animals were part of household magic. They were tied to the rhythms of sowing and reaping, life and death. When Christianity swept through, it couldn't erase those instincts. It just renamed them. So a cow at a wreath becomes a bride. A pig at a feast becomes betrothed. It's all language, but language changes things. Even today, you hear elders murmur phrases like, he's bound to that beast, or she's husband that cow better than most men. These aren't casual sayings. They're echoes of rituals like this one. Later, you're told the particular ceremony began during a long-ago blight, when a village nearly lost every animal to illness. One family held a midnight ritual, pledging their last pig to the land itself, swearing to honor it as kin, not just meat. The pig survived. The blight didn't. And now, they repeat the ritual every year, just in case. You look around. No one here thinks they're actually marrying pigs. Not literally, but symbolically? Oh, absolutely. Because in this world, symbols are reality. A handshake seals a trade. A song heals a heart. A vow, no matter how absurd, can keep a family together when everything else falls apart. You glance at the pig. She's still wearing the wreath, snorting contentedly, totally unaware that she just became a wife, a mascot, and possibly a minor saint, all in one evening. The ale tastes stronger than usual, and you start to think, Maybe Milda deserves more than survival. Maybe she deserves a ritual, not a joke, a gesture, something between thanks and promise. Because here, under stars older than your language, you start to understand marriage, in its strangest forms, isn't about law or lust. It's about binding, about choosing to tie your life to something else, someone else, even if that someone says moo instead of I do. You wake to the sound of bells. Not church bells, not alarm bells, but those little bronze ones tied to the halters of beasts during festivals. It's a sunny morning, unusually so, and already the path outside your cottage is bustling with neighbors. Some carry flowers, others buckets of ale, and at least one man is struggling to hold a particularly stubborn goose in a basket with a lid that absolutely isn't holding. It's wedding day. No, not yours. Not today. Today belongs to Goran, the hay merchant's son, and Buttercup, his favorite cow. And yes, he's doing it for the tax break. But also, according to the speech last night at the tavern, after 3 ciders and a suspiciously poetic turn of phrase, he's doing it for loyalty unmatched in eyes that truly see me, which would have been moving if Buttercup hadn't sneezed halfway through. Still, this is no quiet affair. The whole village is out. Children have woven clover crowns. Old women carry sprigs of rosemary. There's a pig on stilts for reasons no one dares explain. And Buttercup, she's wearing a veil. Not a cow-sized one. An actual human bridal veil. Secured with a rope of braided grass and wildflowers. You squeeze into the crowd just as the procession begins. Buttercup is led through the village square to the beat of a drum made from an old cider barrel. Goran walks beside her barefoot, grinning like a man who just found a silver penny in his soup. They circle the communal bread oven 3 times, an old fertility ritual, though nowadays it's mostly done for luck and photo opportunities. If medieval villagers had cameras, then comes a kiss. Yes, you may now kiss the udder. It's part of the tradition, though. Thankfully, most opt for a symbolic gesture. Goran kneels, bows his head to Buttercup's flank, and places a piece of sweetbread beside her hoof. She sniffs it unimpressed. He kisses her head instead. Applause breaks out. A drunk uncle yells, "Give room." Here's the thing. It all sounds ridiculous, because it is, but also it isn't. These livestock ceremonies, in all their bizarre glory, serve a genuine communal function. On the surface, they're satire, but underneath, they're about acknowledging what keeps a household alive. In a culture that marries people off for land, for alliances, for inheritance, why wouldn't a man symbolically marry the creature that literally plows his fields and fills his bowl? Some historians argue these public displays were rooted in the medieval tradition of chivalry, mock parades used to celebrate or shame unusual marriages. When a man with a much younger woman, or a widow remarried quickly, or a goat wore a bridal veil, the community would respond with drums, bells, and raucous songs. Sometimes to mock, sometimes to bless through laughter, because humor and ritual were not opposites in the medieval mind. They were layers, and for some, these ceremonies were both sincere and ironic. There's an account from 1307 in the town of Egremont of a man who wed his donkey to avoid a marriage arranged by his cousin. The ceremony involved flower garlands, vows in rhyme, and a priest who blessed a union with a wink. But the legal outcome? The man avoided marriage for 3 years, citing emotional bond and prior spiritual engagement. Even more remarkable, the village supported him, because whether they believed in the sanctity of the cow or not, they believed in the right to refuse the alternative. There's also a quirky tidbit buried in a Bavarian court record. A farmer named Hannes declared his cow his first wife and his human bride his second. When questioned, he clarified, "One gives me milk, the other gives me grief. I love both." The scribe added a note, no judgment rendered. Cow did not attend. Laughter aside, these events forged real bonds, not just between man and animal, but within the community. Everyone participated. Children threw petals. Bakers offered rolls. And the official tax collector, more often than not, showed up just to make sure no one was trying to sneak in a real legal claim under all the other smooching. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were more folklore than function, but records exist of mock unions being used to claim tax deferrals. especially in regions where marital status affected land allotment or tithing. In certain manorial systems, a married man paid differently than a single one, particularly if his wife helped with agricultural work. Enter Buttercup. By calling your cow your partner, complete with symbolic gestures, public vows, and enthusiastic neighbors, you might qualify for reduced labor expectations or protection from livestock seizure. Of course, it wasn't foolproof. In 1332, a man in Devon tried to claim his pig as spouse and labor assistant to avoid field work. The steward replied, famously, "Then let her do thy scything." Which fair. Still, the fact that these arguments were even entertained tells you how blurred the boundaries had become. So, you stand among your neighbors, cup in hand, watching Gorin and Buttercup circle the fire pit. You laugh, of course you do, but also, somewhere in your chest, a warmth rises, not from the drink, but from the recognition. This is a world where relationships aren't about romance. They're about function, commitment, and yes, affection, however odd it may look. Later, after the feast, you find Gorin sitting by Buttercup in the barn. He's humming. She's chewing. They look at peace. You ask him, do you really think she's your wife? He chuckles. Nah, but I tell you what, she's more faithful than any girl who's ever kissed me. And she doesn't talk during sermons. Then he leans in, pats her gently, and says, we'll get through next winter together. That's what matters. And you nod, because somehow, that vow, the quiet one, not the one with bells and flower, is the truest thing you've heard all day. There's a saying that floats around the village whenever someone does something slightly too clever or just barely too mad. Might as well leave it to the bull. Most people chuckle and move on. But after what you've seen, the vows, the rituals, the taxes dodged with a well-timed move, you start to wonder what would happen if someone actually did it. And then, one damn morning, you find out. Word spreads fast, carried on the fog like gossip in a bonnet. An old farmer in the next hamlet, over has passed, and there's trouble with the will. Not because it was forged, not because there's a dozen squabbling heirs, but because the will names his bull as next of kin. Specifically, to Reginald, my companion and heir, I leave the west paddock, 2 milk barrels, and all rights to the lower pasture, which has shared with me in faithful toil these many years. The reeve reads it twice, and then a third time, very slowly, in case the parchment changes its mind. It doesn't. Thus begins the strangest inheritance dispute your village has ever heard. And that's saying something, considering the pig cheese lawsuit of 1303. Let's talk about when a bull is your next of kin. In theory, medieval property law revolved around bloodlines and feudal obligations. But in practice, the edges were fuzzy, especially for peasants. With no formal deeds and a legal system held together by whacks, witnesses, and half-remembered oaths, the matter of inheritance was often decided by local custom and community consensus. If enough people said, yes, that bull pulled his plow for 20 years and deserves a field, the case wasn't immediately laughed out of court. It might be mocked, it might be denied, but it would still get a hearing. And in this particular case, Reginald the bull was something of a celebrity, known for surviving a lightning strike, pulling twice the average weight, and once fending off a pack of wolves with the help of a poorly flung rake. He had earned a reputation as nobler than most sons. The farmer had no children, no siblings, and a string of nephews who couldn't even point to his cottage on a map. So he named the bull. The villagers backed it. Whether out of loyalty, mischief, or sheer curiosity, they decided to support the claim. A petition was drawn up. A clerk was bribed with pickled turnips. And Reginald, lord of the lower pasture, became a very confusing legal entity. Here's where things get legally loopy. Because animals could be named in contracts, as objects, as property, but as beneficiaries? That got tricky. There's a documented 12th century case from Burgundy where a farmer left land to his faithful dog, Karen, until such time as the Lord should call him. The local abbey ruled that the land would be held in trust for Karen, with a neighbor assigned as keeper and executor. In other words, Karen owned the land as long as he was alive, but someone else managed it. It was a workaround, and it became a pattern. Many fringe inheritance contracts during this time used animals as temporary anchors, symbols of continuity. By assigning land to a beast, the owner could stall its transfer, delay taxes, create a gap that allowed trusted neighbors or non-relatives to act as caretakers without formal ownership. So back to Reginald. The court, such as it was, consisting of a reeve, a scribe, and a priest with a hangover, debated for hours. The bull, oblivious, munched hay, and occasionally knocked over ink pots. The scribe started referring to him in the records as Reginaldus, first of his line. He drew a little crown beside the name. At one point, the priest asked whether Reginald had been baptized. The reeve replied, probably cleaner than half the parish. Ultimately, they ruled in favor of a partial grant. Reginald would hold the field in name, with the deceased apprentice acting as steward. Taxes would be delayed 1 year. The nephews, furious, left in a cloud of curses and chicken feathers. Reginald remained unmoved. This story became legendary, but it wasn't the only one. In a fragmented roll from Saxony, a cow named Hildegard was named as matron of field and larder, which scholars believe was a symbolic way to prevent seizure of household goods. In the margins, a monk had scribbled, "Beasts rise in rank as sons fall in favor." And honestly, that's the whole idea. These acts weren't just about sentiment. They were about control. In a system where the church and nobility dictated everything from your waistline to your woodpile, using a beast to hold property was a subtle rebellion, a way of saying, you don't get to decide. He does, and he's chewing your paperwork. Historians still argue whether these symbolic inheritances were taken seriously by the law or just tolerated as eccentricities. Some point out that as literacy spread and centralized law took hold, such practices vanished. Others argue they simply evolved into trusts, pet clauses, and charitable bequests. After all, even today, people leave fortunes to their cats. Whole mansions, entire libraries. So maybe the medieval bull was just ahead of his time. Back in your village, Reginald's story becomes a sort of folk hero myth. Children lead him offerings, carrots, clovers, very small sticks of incense shaped like grass. The reed begins calling him your honor. A traveling juggler writes a song. Reginald the bull, who shamed every heir, mooed once for justice, twice for fair share. But most importantly, you start hearing other farmers murmur things like, if anything happens to me, the field goes to Milda. Or, my chickens will inherit this coop, I swear it. Not because they expect it to hold, but because the act itself means something. A quiet defense against a world that never asked your name, but always knew the exact number of sheep you owed. So tonight, while Milda chews her cud, you fold a small scrap of parchment. It's not fancy. It's barely legible. But at the top you write, in the event of my passing, all rights to the upper plot shall belong to Milda, companion, worker, wife, and all but word. You sign it with a mark. Fold it. Tuck it under a stone by the door. And whisper, long live the queen. You're patching the barn roof when the wind shifts, sharp, smoky, charged. It carries a faint scent of heather and something else, something old. You glance toward the hills. Storm coming? Maybe. Or maybe it's just spring stirring in its bones again. But that tingling at the back of your neck? That's not weather. That's the feeling you get when someone's whispering your name in a language older than Latin. Your neighbor, Una, appears at your fence with a handful of herbs and a gleam in her eye. Tonight, she says, we bless the black cow. You blink. You mean Milda? Una snorts. No, child, not your cow. The cow. And just like that, you're swept into the world of curses, hexes, and heifers. It turns out marrying your cow isn't always about taxes, loopholes, or affection. Sometimes it's about breaking a curse. Let's rewind. The medieval countryside is not what you call rational. For every priest preaching sin and salvation, there's an herbalist mumbling charms over steaming pots, a shepherd who swears the moon speaks to sheep, and a baker who won't touch dough on a waning moon. Magic doesn't just exist. It leaks into everything. The earth is alive. The stars watch. And your livestock? They're halfway between the mundane and the mystical, which is why. When crops fail or calves are stillborn or your neighbor's wheat grows taller than yours, suspicion starts to bloom like mold in a flour sack. Someone cursed you, probably Margaret from 2 farms over. She does own 3 black chickens and once looked at your butter churn a little too long. What's the antidote? Sometimes a livestock marriage. Yes, in some regions, especially across the Scottish Highlands and remote parts of Wales, fringe ritualists believe that symbolically marrying your primary beast, be it cow, goat, or pig, could dispel malevolent enchantment. You weren't just forming a bond. You were forming a protective pact. The logic went like this. If your cow was truly yours in the spiritual sense, she couldn't be taken by witches, fairies, or demons. If you bound your soul to hers, through vow, ritual, or even simple words, then she'd carry your luck and you'd carry hers. Curses would bounce. In some areas, these ceremonies were whispered rites performed at night, under specific moon phases. You'd tie a cord between your wrists and the cow's horn, speak a vow over a buried egg, and walk her backward around the house 3 times. You think that's strange? Some practitioners claim these unions not only reversed curses, but redirected them. That is, once the marriage was sealed, any harmful spell cast on you or your beast would ricochet back to its source. Consider it medieval magical insurance. There's a case from 1272, tucked in the margins of an ecclesiastical court transcript from Cumbria, where a man was accused of binding himself to a sow in unnatural contract to repel spirits. The trial record is half ruined by mildew, but the surviving text mentions a priest scolding man for placing the Eucharist beneath the pig's hooves and calling it a shield against hexing. Historians are baffled, but folklorists, they nod knowingly, because similar rites appear across Celtic traditions. A cow anointed with garlic and ash, led through a ring of iron, and wed to her keeper as part of a blessing. The words vary, but the intent is the same. We are one now. Let no ill part us. In fact, one Highland prayer translates roughly to, with this oath and this flame, I join my hand to thine hoof. May all curses pass by our house, seeking easier prey. You can't make this stuff up. And you start to notice the patterns. When illness spreads, when crops wither, when goats go missing in the night, people bind themselves to their beasts. Because animals are bridges between flesh and field, between people and powers older than prayer. You hear whispers of the green mare Darren, a creature supposedly wedded to 3 generations of farmers, whose continued presence kept wolves and misfortune at bay. They say when the 4th son refused the ritual, the mare vanished, and a hailstorm flattened every oat stalk in the valley. Coincidence? Maybe, but in a world without insurance, folklore does the job. There's a quirky record from central France describing a man who had his cow to break a series of bad omens. His shoes fell apart mid-step. His bread kept burning in the oven. His daughter swore she heard whispers coming from the well. So he did what any cursed man would do. He made a garland of rowan, burned a splinter of his own roof beam, and stood beside his cow in the moonlight. The marriage was brief, but apparently the bread baked evenly after that. Even clergy occasionally bent the rules when the village got scared enough. There's one account of a deacon in Westphalia who performed a binding rite between a pig and a farmer during a mysterious illness that swept through the hog pens. It wasn't a wedding, exactly, but it looked like one. There were prayers, a ribbon, and even a little sermon about faith in all God's creatures. The illness passed. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or just a clever placebo. But you know better. You've seen how desperate people get when the air feels wrong. How every bump in the night becomes a warning. How the cow becomes a totem, a companion, and a ward against the dark. So tonight, Azuna leads a ritual. Simple this time. Just a circle of salt, a crown of clover, and a few softly spoken words. You watch her bless the black cow. Not your Milda, but one just like her. The cow blinks slowly, unimpressed. Una turns to you and says, sometimes the land gets hungry for names. You ask what she means. She shrugs. If you don't claim what's yours, something else will. Later, you lie beside the fire, hand on the warm floorboards above the barn, and you whisper the words again. What is mine is thine. What else seeks me must pass through thee. Milda shifts in her stall, sighs, and goes back to sleep. The wind outside changes. And just for a moment, you swear the air smells like rosemary and firewood instead of rot. The snow is gone, the mud is back, and the abbey is humming with that slow, methodical energy that only monks and bees seem to understand. You're visiting because the roof of your cottage is threatening collapse. And the brothers sometimes lend timber if you ask politely. And if you don't remind them about the time their prize goose got drunk on cider at last year's feast, while Brother Arden rifles through his ledgers, muttering about wood planks and weight limits, you wander through the cloister garden. It's peaceful, quiet, until you hear it. A bray. Not a soft, pastoral bray. A dramatic, drawn-out, fully committed theatrical bray that echoes through the stone corridors like a trumpet announcing Judgment Day. You round the corner, and there she is. The donkey, gray, dignified, wear what looks like a stitched little vest and a wreath of rosemary around her neck. And beside her, Brother Salvius, the youngest friar, face flushed, spoon-feeding her bits of soaked bread with the care of a mother doting on her only child. You just stumbled into the infamous tale of the monastery's favorite donkey. It starts like all good absurdities with famine. A decade ago, the monks here nearly lost their entire livestock pen to a bitter frost and a suspicious case of hay rot. Only one donkey survived. This donkey, the monks took it as a sign. She was renamed Sora Margarita, Sister Margaret, and formally blessed by the abbot. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Over time, Sister Margaret was elevated, not just blessed, adored. She was given a space in the cloister barn, separate from the other animals. She received a daily apple. Once, during Lent, the kitchen monk swore she received more food than the brothers. She was listed on the monastery's food roster under companions of the order, sandwiched between Brother Lucian and the vegetable steward. And then it got stranger. One day, the abbot declared she would be treated with full monastic dignity. That meant she wasn't just an animal anymore. She was a spiritual companion, equal in devotion, if not vows. She never took holy orders, of course, but she was permitted to attend morning prayers. She stood beside the monks during meals, and once, during Advent, she was draped in velvet and walked in solemn procession around the cloister as the friars chanted hymns. No one ever said the word marriage. Not aloud, but there were rumors, whispers that Brother Salvius, gentle, poetic, painfully shy, had formed a bond with Sister Margaret deeper than mere companionship. He was seen reading psalms to her, murmuring little blessings against her ears, and, on one unforgettable day, tying a ribbon to her tail and calling her beloved of the Lord. Of course, some say it was all symbolic, an expression of Franciscan kinship, honoring all creatures. After all, St. Francis himself once preached to birds and called animals his brethren, but others, particularly the visiting bishop, were less amused. He came to investigate, naturally, wanted to know if this so-called sister was receiving tithes. She wasn't, though someone did once donate a whole pie in her honor. When he arrived, he found her comfortably asleep on a pile of linen, with a psalter propped open beside her and a faint smell of lavender wafting from her fur. The bishop was unsettled. He questioned Brother Salvius for hours, wanted to know if he had taken any oaths, if he had written anything that resembled a vow, if he had ever, God forbid, used a marriage rite in jest. Salvius denied it all, politely, softly, while petting the donkey. No written contract ever surfaced. But one of the other friars later admitted, under the influence of fermented turnip beer, that Salvius had once whispered, "Till death or braying do us part." The bishop left that night, and Margaret stayed. The tale became legend, a local joke, a point of pilgrimage for nearby farmers who needed a story to cheer them through their chores. But beneath the laughter was something else, a sense of wonder, of unspoken truth. Because even if it wasn't legal or romantic, or anything the church would sanction, there was a bond. Brother Salvius aged quickly after Margaret died. He wore a scrap of her blanket tied to his belt until he passed, mumbling something about stars and fields. The other monks say he was smiling when he went. The abbey keeps her memory alive. A small plaque in the stable reads, "Sister Margaret. She labored, she brayed, she endured. So why does this matter? Because it shows that animal unions weren't always about property or survival or tricking the tax man. Sometimes they were about companionship in its purest form. When you live in isolation, surrounded by prayers and silence, and one creature shares that silence with you, daily, patiently, without complaint, that creature becomes something more, not human, but not just animal either. Historians still argue whether the Margaret story was ever taken seriously, or if it was just another oddity in a world already too full of them. But the Abbey's records are clear. For nearly 10 years, that donkey was treated with reverence, not mocked, not parroted, revered. You walked back to your cottage, the tale sitting heavy in your mind. You think of Milda, not a saint, not a sister, but yours. Constant, patient, there in storm and drought. Maybe not sacred, but certainly not nothing. And you wonder, if someone asked years from now who you shared your days with, would it sound foolish to say a cow? Or would it just sound true? You place a hand on her flank. She flicks her tail, leans into your touch. You don't speak vows. Not tonight. But you hum a little tune, slow and warm like a hymn. And she stays beside you until the stars come out. The tax collector arrives just after breakfast, which, by medieval standards, means you've had a crust of yesterday's bread and a gulp of something vaguely resembling broth. He's wearing too much velvet for someone who works on dirt roads, and his boots are somehow both spotless and smug. He announces his presence with a cough that sounds premeditated, then begins unfurling a scroll that nearly drags in the mud. You sigh. You were hoping to spend the day patching the south wall. Instead, it looks like you're about to go toe-to-hoof with bureaucracy. He lists the usual: grain levy, livestock tally, tithe in kind. Then the big one, beast dues. Every animal over a certain weight, age, or output must be registered and taxed accordingly. The rates change every season, like the weather and the church's position on singing during Lent. He reaches Milda's name on the list, pauses, and squints. Property or partner? He asks. You smile. Wife. The silence stretches. A chicken sneezes in the distance. Welcome to the arcane art of milking the law. See, by now, enough people have tried, whispered, and actually pulled off livestock marriage schemes that has become a minor legal headache. Not widespread, not sanctioned, but real enough that some collectors now ask the question outright. Because livestock, once married or symbolically partnered, might fall into any number of legal gray zones. Shared property, household co-tenant, sacred companion, or even ecclesiastically exempt being. And guess what? Each of those categories gets taxed differently. There's an infamous account from 1341 where a farmer in Kent classified his cow as a spiritually joined dependent. He'd drawn up a mock marriage certificate, witnessed by his cousins and a scribe with suspiciously poor penmanship. When the collector tried to list her as taxable livestock, the man protested, loudly and with the full support of his neighbors. The steward tried to escalate, but by the time the abbey got involved, the cow had died under sacred vows. There was a funeral, a small one, but with hymns and a very confused priest. The tax was dropped, out of respect. Stories like this weren't isolated. Over the years, peasant households developed a small but surprisingly creative toolkit of legal evasion tactics involving their animals. And marriage? That was just the start. Let's look at a few. 1. Symbolic conversion. By giving your animal a religious role, monastic companion, blessed creature, vow-bound servant, you can make it eligible for clerical exemption. After all, the church didn't tax itself. If your cow was technically part of sacred order, however far-fetched, she might get the same treatment. In one German case, a goat named Gertrude was declared a pilgrim in penance and wore a crude scallop shell necklace. No taxes for 2 years. 2. Dowry protection. If your animal was married to you and listed as having brought goods into the marriage, she could be shielded under dowry law. That meant she wasn't livestock. She was property held in common. One scribe even noted, as the wife brings a bucket, so she shares a milk. 3. Guardianship claims. Some farmers assign guardianship of their animals to the local church or to children under the age of majority. The tax collector couldn't seize property held in trust for a child. Or a donkey. The child might get confused. The donkey? Definitely not. But of course, none of this was foolproof. In 1313, a tax inquiry in Lincolnshire uncovered a rash of animal adoptions and symbolic marriages. 23 cows, 6 pigs, and 1 particularly grumpy rooster were found to be living under altered tax status. The reeve, incensed, declared them all unwed by force of law. A dozen men protested. The rooster bit someone. The matter ended with an official proclamation. Henceforth, no beast shall enter into union, compact, or covenant in avoidance of royal duty, which only made people try harder. Historians still argue whether this whole mess qualifies as legal fraud or folk resistance. Some say it was mockery. Others say it was survival. The truth, as always, probably lives somewhere in between. Because let's face it, when your options are starvation, punishment, or clever paperwork involving a cow-shaped loophole, you get creative. Even more curious, some local judges tolerated it. There's a court record from Brittany where the judge literally wrote, "While the cow may not speak her vows, neither can she dispute them. Let the arrangement stand, for it causes no harm." The collectors hated this. In retaliation, they started including new categories on tax rolls. Animal, common, taxable. Animal, companion. Inspect before taxing. Animal, claim bonded, report to priest. Animal, spiritual, avoid confrontation. Yes, that last one is real. You'd think this would lead to chaos. And in some towns, it did. A village near Dijon once reported 27 married pigs in a single season. The steward wrote a very sad letter home and retired early. But for most villages, it became a game, an unspoken agreement. The taxman asked, you answered. If you had the garland, the paper, the right kind of solemn shrug, the animal got a pass. And so you stand now, watching your tax collector tap his quill against Milda's name. He sighs. Is there documentation? You hand him a folded parchment. It's not official, exactly, just a few words scrawled by the reeve, with his mark and your own, and a date circled in charcoal. Symbolic binding in recognition of labor and loyalty. He raises an eyebrow, nods, and ticks the column labeled status, exempt temporary. And just like that, Milda's off the hook. She, of course, has no idea. She just flicks her tail and goes back to eating. Later by the fire, you toast her with a mug of ale and say, "You're the best loophole I've ever known." She snorts as if in agreement. And tomorrow, you might add a second ribbon to her halter, just in case the collector comes back with questions. You're sitting under the old elm by the pond, chewing a strip of dried turnip and wondering, as you often do, how things got this weird. Around you, the village hums like usual. Chickens arguing, someone yelling about butter, a donkey making business decisions in the background. And then comes Jonnet. Everyone calls him the village idiot, which is unfair because he can count, sing, and once constructed a working windmill out of cheese boxes and stubbornness. But he also talked to Puddles, wears one boot in summer, and last year tried to pay his taxes in good intentions. So, yes, Jonnet, today, he's dressed for a wedding. His hair is slicked back with what you strongly suspect is lard. He's wearing 2 belts, one around his waist, the other diagonally across his chest like a sash of office. And trailing beside him, in a wreath of daisies and what looks like someone's curtain, is a cow. Not a fine cow. A half-blind, slightly knock-kneed creature named Matilda, known for wandering into bake ovens, and once eating a bishop's mitten. Jonnet grins. She said yes. You blink. To what? He holds up a ring. Not a real ring. A brass curtain loop. To forever. And just like that, you're wrapped up in a village idiot's vow. A story so ridiculous, so lopsided and sincere, that it might just be the most honest marriage in the whole county. Let's be clear. No one asked John to do this. No tax benefit. No inheritance trick. No curse to reverse. He's not trying to delay grain levies or confuse the church. He just loves his cow. And maybe that's the strangest part. Because for once, we're not talking about clever loopholes or fringe rituals. This is affection. pure and unfiltered through law or superstition. The ceremony takes place beside the pond. Half the village shows up, not because they believe, but because it's Jonnet. And because, well, it's something to do that isn't scraping frost off barley shoots. The blacksmith acts as officiant. The baker sings. Someone plays a lute very badly. Jonnet kneels. Matilda, from the day you licked the mud off my boots and mistook my hat for a salt lick, I knew you were the one. The crowd titters. He continues. I pledge to rub your ears when you're weary, share my best oats, and never speak ill of your droppings, which I know are a gift. Somewhere, a man laughs so hard he drops a soup. Matilda flicks her tail, and when Jonnet leans in for the kiss, someone shouts, "Watch out! She bites!" But he does it anyway, right on the forehead. The crowd cheers, and for one brief, muddy, absurd moment, everyone believes. This wasn't the first time a fool married a cow. There are stories, some humorous, some deeply tragic, scattered across Europe of men and women so lonely, so starved for affection or purpose, that they turned to the only creature who didn't judge them. In one 13th century tale from Belgium, a woman named Alls declared herself wife to the oxen after her husband died and her children scattered. She gave them names, sang to them, built them a cradle. Local records list her estate as occupied by animals and one mad widow. But she lived out her years fed, warm, and oddly content. In the Baltic region, there's a haunting tale of a shepherd who lost his mind after a raid and took vows with his youth despite the gods. Villagers mocked him, but secretly left bread near his hut. The ewe lived longer than most humans. The shepherd died with a smile. Historians still argue whether these stories are real, metaphoric, or rural jokes told around fires to lighten long winters. But they appear too often and across too many regions to be coincidence. In medieval society, where isolation was as deadly as disease, animals offered something people often didn't: uncomplicated presents. No status games. No dowries. No whispered schemes about whose field to marry into. Just presence. Day after day. Warmth. Breath. Familiarity. Jonnet, for all his quirks, understands that. He talks to Matilda the way lovers do in troubadour songs, minus the French and with more references to cud. Later, at the reception, 3 jugs of cider and a wheel of suspicious cheese. You overhear someone ask him, "Why a cow?" Jonnet replies, "Because she never lied, she never left, and she's always glad to see me. What more could I want?" You scoff because it's silly, but you also feel something twist inside. Not jealousy, not pity, something else. A kind of quiet recognition. Jonnet's no fool. Not really. He just refused to settle for the kind of love that required contracts or curses or convenient tax policies. He chose the kind of love that listens to breath and body and knows that a gentle headbutt in the morning says more than any vow. And here's the kicker. The village accepts it. No one files complaints. No one drags him before the bishop. They just let him have it. This strange, beautiful thing, because deep down, they know the world is cruel and loud and often very cold. And if one man finds warmth in a cow, well, that's one less cold heart. Tonight, as you watch the stars come out, you see Jonnet leading Matilda home. He's still humming. She's still chewing. They're not rich. They're not protected by law or ceremony, but they're together. And in a world full of people who lie, cheat, vanish, or die too soon, maybe that's the most sacred vow of all. The year is 1351, and the world has changed. Not just the weather, not just the fields, not just the rising price of rye, but everything. You walk past abandoned cottages with doors swinging like broken teeth. You count empty beds. You call out names and hear no answer but the wind. The plague came and left no one untouched. And in its wake, the world feels tilted, strange, like the rules of the game have changed, but no one told the peasants. You survived, but not unscathed. You've buried neighbors. You've watched the church overflow with bodies and still run out of prayers. You've stood in fields that once teemed with life, now silent, overgrown, haunted by the memory of laughter. Milda survived too, of all things, of all creatures. Your cow, quiet and stubborn and thoroughly unimpressed by the apocalypse, survived. And now, with the world emptied and strange, the thought begins to bloom in your skull like a weed. What if you made it official? Because in a world where everyone else is gone and love has become a memory spoken in past tense, the bond you share with your cow starts to feel like something more. That's how you find yourself, weeks later, standing barefoot in the ruins of chapel, holding a candle in one hand and a piece of lard cake in the other, preparing to officiate the strangest ceremony since Noah started matching animals 2 by 2. This is you, the plague, and the pig bride. Well, technically she's a cow, but pig bride is what the village calls any animal union forged in the wake of loss. It's not an insult, it's tradition. A new tradition born from trauma and stitched together with dark humor and quiet defiance. Because when everyone dies and the world feels cursed, the old rules crack. And in the cracks, people build new ways to hope. After the first waves of plague in the late 1340s, rural Europe was transformed. Entire communities vanished. Clergy were reduced to skeleton crews. Bureaucracy buckled. And suddenly, the rigid social structures that once governed every birth, union, and burial softened. People married who they wanted. Some married quickly, some desperately. Some, like you, started marrying outside the expected boundaries altogether. Not because it was sanctioned, but because the church wasn't watching. And sometimes, when the world forgets to look, you remember how to feel. You're not alone in this. All across Europe, strange unions blossom in the dust of plague. There's a Flemish widow who declared herself the wife of her prize sow, saying it was the only creature who had seen her cry and stayed. There's a shepherd in Gascony who wrote a poem, half eulogy, half wedding vow, to the last sheep in his flock, then tied a bit of his hair to her wool and whispered, "Together or not at all." Were these real marriages? Historians still argue, but they happened, and they were taken seriously by the people who needed them to be. In parts of rural Italy, Plague-era records mention companion blessings performed by wandering monks, often involving a survivor and their sole remaining animal. These weren't weddings officially, but the phrasing borrows heavily from the Roman rite. In hardship we bind, in hunger we share, and in mourning we endure. Even the symbols changed. Instead of rings, people exchanged bits of ribbon, hair, or cloth. Instead of flowers, bundles of herbs meant to ward off death. Instead of kissing, they placed hands on fur, on flank, on snout, gentle, reverent. There's even a documented account, bless the notary who didn't blink, of a farmer in southern England who entered a plague vow with his cow, calling her my tether to the living. He insisted on listing her name, Bridget, in the local marriage roll, though the clerk eventually crossed it out and added null and symbolic. But what is a marriage if not symbolic? After plague, symbols mattered more. People needed rituals, any rituals, to hold together the pieces of their grief. In one haunting account from Bohemia, a woman who lost her entire family held a wedding feast for herself and her goat. She served bread, lit candles, sang a lullaby. No one interrupted. No one mocked her. They all came, sat, ate, and mourned with her, because the feast wasn't for the goat. It was for the act of surviving. That's what plague marriages are, in the end. Not legal farces or folklore footnotes, but attempts at saying I'm still here when the world tells you shouldn't be. They're gestures of mourning, of gratitude, of refusal, and sometimes, yes, of madness. Grief does that. But you watch Milda chew her cud, hear the steady rhythm of her breathing beside the crumbled altar, and you realize this isn't madness. It's love, not the romantic kind, the resilient kind, the kind that stays. You light your candle. You offer her the lard cake. She sniffs it, takes it. You bow your head and whisper the words you've heard at every wedding since childhood, now spoken to an animal who has never lied to you. In field and frost, in breath and bone, I take thee. You don't expect an answer, but Milda turns her head, licks your cheek once, then lowers herself onto the soft straw, eyes half lidded in that bovine expression of complete and total peace. Later, you'll carve her name into the old chapel stone, not as wife, not as property, but as witness to the life you still live, to the love you've chosen, to the bond that held when everything else broke. By the summer of 1352, the church finally decides it's had enough of your nonsense. Not you personally, of course. No one at Canterbury is staying up late muttering, "That blasted farmer with the veiled cow." But in a broader, clumsy way, they've noticed that something is deeply wrong in the countryside. Parish reports trickle in, each more bewildered than the last. Pigs receiving funeral rites, goats listed as brides in manor scrolls, cows named in communion rosters. One bishop writes simply, "The flock has mistaken beasts for brethren." So begins the slow, awkward, and mostly unsuccessful attempt at church crackdowns and clergy confusion. You first hear of it from the tanner's wife, who always knows things before anyone else, except when it comes to her husband's terrible singing, which she pretends not to notice. She tells you the bishop is sending out orders. Priests must investigate any rumors of livestock unions, and all symbolic marriages are to be denounced publicly. You raise an eyebrow. Publicly? She nods. From the pulpit. You laugh, because you've seen what happens when Father Hobb tries to speak over a coughing fit, let alone a determined cow. Still, the orders are real. Across England and beyond, a series of pastoral letters and episcopal mandates begin to circulate, urging clergy to reaffirm the sacramental nature of matrimony and to condemn any mock unions between humans and beasts. The language is half stern, half baffled. One document reads, "Let no priest preside over rites between man and animal, whether by word, song, or symbol, lest he lead the flock astray with comedy dressed as covenant." Another warns against heifer-honoring gatherings of unnatural affection, which, aside from sounding like a medieval indie band, basically refers to any public ceremony involving vows, veils, or garlands between species. But the priests? Most of them shrug, because they've seen what you've seen. They watch you bury your neighbors, bless your bread with tears, and cling to your animals like lifelines. They know the difference between heresy and human desperation. Still, orders are orders. Father Hobb delivers the first sermon against bovine idolatry on a Sunday, so hot even the bees are yawning. He wipes his brow, coughs twice, and begins, "Dear flock, I bring you guidance. You may not marry your flock." Muffled laughter. Nor your cow, nor your pig, nor your goose, no matter how fondly she honks. Someone nearly chokes on a plum. He continues, voice rising. "Marriage is a holy union, sanctified and sacred. It must be between a man and a woman, not a man and his donkey, not a woman and her ewe, and not, under any circumstances, a farmer and his cow named Agnes, who I am told wore a veil last week near the village stone." Now it's a full-on riot of snorts and elbow nudges. The sermon collapses under its own absurdity, because by now, the idea of livestock marriage is no longer taboo. It's a tradition. Strange, yes, but stitched into the very rhythm of village life. Still, the church pushes harder. Some bishops order investigations. Others send envoys to rural parishes to ensure no unauthorized rites are being performed. In certain areas, they even threaten excommunication, though only one actual case is known. A friar in Aragon who held a blessing of beasts during a plague and included a goat dressed in a bridal smock. He claimed it was symbolic. His superior claimed it was scandalous. He was reassigned to a monastery known for its silence and lack of livestock. The irony? In trying to suppress these unions, the church amplifies them. What was once a quiet ritual of grief or gratitude becomes a kind of folk protest. Farmers begin intentionally parodying wedding rites, ringing bells, wearing cloaks, tying cows to trees in sacred pledge. Children invent songs. Teens dare each other to wed their geese for laughs. One parish in Normandy reports a festival of vows, where entire households participate in mock marriages with their favorite animals, complete with toasts and declarations like, "I, Geoffrey, take thee, Myrtle, to chew and to cherish." And behind the humor, defiance, because the peasants may not have parchment or power, but they understand one thing better than the bishops. Ceremony is control. If you control the ritual, you control the meaning. And if you can redefine marriage to include a cow, whether seriously or satirically, you've claimed a piece of power that was never meant to be yours. Historians still argue whether these resistance rituals were truly intended as rebellion, but more and more agree they serve as cultural pressure valves, letting ordinary people reclaim dignity in a system built to deny them autonomy. The church didn't stop there. By the 1360s, a few ambitious clergymen attempted doctrinal corrections. Sermons were updated, catechisms revised. In one case, a priest staged a play in which a farmer tries to marry a cow and is struck by lightning, a plot that fails utterly when the audience starts rooting for the cow. Eventually, the church pivots. Instead of cracking down, they try to reabsorb practice. Some orders begin holding annual feasts of St. Francis, where animals are blessed in church courtyards and symbolic vows of care are spoken. No more weddings, but plenty of garlands. And gradually, the fringe ritual of livestock marriage is reshaped into something permissible, laughable, tolerable. You hear whispers that the Abbey is drafting a formal guideline for companion blessings, where farmers may swear oaths of loyalty and gratitude to their beasts without invoking marriage. It's not the same, but it's close enough to satisfy most, especially those who never wanted the marriage to be legal, just meaningful. Still, you keep your old vow tucked behind the firewood, not because you expect to need it, but because it reminds you of a time when no one else survived but you and Milda, and how that bond meant more than sermons or signatures. Tonight, she nudges you gently as you sit by the embers. You scratch her behind the ears and murmur, "They can take the rights, but they'll never take the ribbons." She blinks slowly, and you swear, for just a heartbeat, she looks like she's smiling. You're at the midsummer fair, standing beside a woman dressed in a sack with daisies in her hair, watching a man read wedding vows to a chicken. The chicken is not paying attention. In fairness, neither is the crowd. Most are already half-drunk, red-faced, and pretending this is normal, which, depending on your standards for normal, it kind of is. He ends a speech with a flourish, holds up a crust of barley bread, and declares, "With this crumb, I thee wed." Someone throws a turnip in approval, and for the rest of the afternoon, the chicken wears a ribbon. This is where it all starts to collapse into confusion. Not because the act itself is new. No. People have been marrying livestock in serious, satirical, and sometimes desperate ways for centuries, but because no one can agree anymore if it's a joke or not. Welcome to the cultural twilight zone where satire or serious. Scholars can't decide. Let's be honest. The medieval world was already blurred at the edges. Symbol and sincerity often walked hand in hand. People prayed to saints while leaving offerings to river spirits. They married for land, then wept like poets at funerals. They mocked nobles by dressing up pigs in robes, but also crowned pigs as mock kings during festivals, and sometimes really let them decide things. So when it came to people standing up beside a cow, swearing oaths and tying ribbon around horns, it's hard to tell if they were making a point, making a pact, or making fun. One famous story from 1382 tells of a man in Norwich who wed a goose during a market parade. The local record described the event in excruciating detail. Costumes, music, the recitation of mock vows. Everyone laughed. It was clearly satire, except a second record, written later that same year, notes that the same goose was added to the man's household tie list as a partner and was later buried in consecrated ground, with small honors, and assured him. So was it a joke? Was it a protest? Was it a joke that became something else? That's the question that modern historians still can't answer. You read arguments from two very passionate academics. One insists these unions were nothing but exaggerated carnival acts, parchivalry, medieval mockery rituals used to shame rule breakers or celebrate social oddities. Another argues that these ceremonies were masked vows of grief and gratitude in a world that couldn't explain its own loss. They both have evidence. They both quote the same sources. They both sound convincing. The truth is probably neither, or both, because context is everything. In a famine year, the vow is probably desperate. In a village where half the people are dead, and the priest forgot how to smile, it might be sincere. But during a festival after 6 pints of mead, when someone wraps a wreath around their ox and shouts, "Let's never part, Bertha," you're not looking at a marriage. You're looking at a meme. Before memes were a thing. It's easy to forget that medieval people had a sense of humor. A weird one, sure, but humor nonetheless. They loved satire. They loved parody. They dressed up cats in miniature tunics. They wrote poems about lice. They laughed at their own misfortunes, mostly because if they didn't, they'd cry straight into the plague pit. Livestock weddings, especially later in the 14th century, became part of this satire tradition. The very act of pretending to marry an animal was a way of mocking the absurdity of legal systems, of romantic tropes, of power structures too rigid to bend. But, and here's where it gets messy, some people leaned in too far. Because satire only works when everyone's in on the joke. And sometimes the joke started sounding an awful lot like sincerity. There's a tale from Wales about a man named Idris who declared himself bound in spirit to his cow, Gwyneth. It started as a jest. He even performed mock vows at the tavern. But over the years, he built her a decorated stall, left offerings of herbs every solstice, and requested she be buried beside him. The village mocked him until Gwyneth died, and Idris broke. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, just sat beside her grave, whispering her name. When he died the following spring, the priest, who once condemned the ritual, delivered a full funeral mass. Because love, even if foolish, still deserves dignity, he said. The line between satire and sincerity didn't just blur, it dissolved. And now, generations later, you stand at the fair, watching a girl braid her goat's hair and whisper something too soft to hear. Is she playing? Is she performing? Or is she praying? You don't ask, because you know, better than most, that not every ritual needs an audience to be real. Sometimes what begins in jest ends in meaning. Historians still squabble over these blurred lines. One school of thought argues that livestock marriages became a kind of peasant theater, a safe place to mock and mourn, to act out frustrations under the guise of comedy. Another insists they were emotional anchors, giving voice to feelings too strange to admit openly. Grief, loneliness, devotion, relief. But all agree on one thing. They meant something to someone, and that's enough. Tonight, as the fair winds down and the chicken bride struts off with her new husband, you see the laughter fading into quiet warmth. People exchange looks. Some clap the man on the back. Some shake their heads. No one scolds. No one calls the priest. Because the lines might be blurred, but the intention is clear. Connection, in whatever form it takes. Later, you sit by the fire and remember your own vows, spoken in half-light, sealed with warmth and quiet breath. Were they serious? Were they satire? Does it matter? They were yours. And in a world still full of emptiness and ache, that feels more sacred than anything written in a bishop's book, the wind is shifting again. Not in the usual turn-of-the-season way. This one feels older, like the stories you thought were jokes have begun walking around in daylight, wearing strange smiles and stranger hats. It starts with a song. You hear it from the blacksmith's apprentice, half sung, half muttered, while he sharpens blades too dull to matter. Something about a girl who loved a cow so much she leapt into the river with it, and they both turned into stars. There's a refrain, lilting and melancholy. Braid the bell, bind the tail, he waits for her beyond the veil. You ask him where he heard it. Always been sung, he says with shrug, old as rain. And just like that, you realize that what was once desperation, ritual, or rebellion has now turned into something else entirely. From mood to myth. It's not just songs. It's riddles, plays, bedtime tales told to children who giggle and pretend they're marrying the neighbor's goose. And sometimes it's solemn. There's a local saying passed down among dairy families. A cow keeps your secrets best. That's not poetry. That's lore. You remember the tale of the three milk sisters, passed like a whisper across counties. 3 cows, bound by vow to 3 maidens who lost their betrothed in war. The women refused to remarry. Instead, they raised the cows as partners, lived long and quietly prosperous lives. And when they died, the cows stood vigil for 3 nights, lowing at the moon. Some say the sisters and cows were buried together. Some say the cows still roam the moors. Of course, none of this is in official records. You won't find it in court scrolls or royal writs. But ask the grandmothers and hedge witches and the old man with fingers like roots, and they'll tell you these stories are truer than truth. Because once something crosses into myth, it gets stronger, not weaker. And livestock marriages, once scandalous or hilarious or legally slippery, have taken on the shimmer of legend. They become part of the cultural compost, what gets turned under and fertilized until it grows strange fruit. It's not hard to see why. These tales aren't about cows. Not really. They're about loyalty that doesn't waver, about partnership that doesn't judge, about the one constant in a world of fevers, famines, and failures, the warm breath of a beast who knows your footsteps and forgives your bad singing. And as history fades, myth fills in the gaps. In the lowlands, you hear about the bride of the barrow, a young woman said to have wed her ox to escape a cursed engagement. The ox turned out to be a shape-shifted knight, bound by spell. The marriage broke the curse. They ruled the village together, built a bridge of stone and horn, and left behind no descendants. Just a spring that never freezes and the sound of hooves at twilight. You smile. Classic myth pattern. Enchantment, transformation, a moral hidden under hay. But others are darker. The ballad of old Ronel tells of a farmer who wedded his cow for gold, broke the vow in greed, and was trampled by ghostly cattle every year on the eve of harvest. Children are told to leave oats at their door, so Ronel's herd eats elsewhere. Even modern scholars, those dry souls with spectacles and stern fingers, admit that these legends form a mythic undercurrent in rural folklore. There are over 70 regional stories across Europe involving humans and livestock in symbolic or magical unions. Most are fairy tale coded. 3 trials, a vow, a transformation, a price. And they all echo the same truth, that animals, especially the ones who labor beside us, are more than meat. You begin to see these echoes everywhere. That carved stone in the chapel with the hoof print? Legend says it marked the wedding of a priest's daughter and her donkey, punished for loving too freely. The stone never mosses. That gnarled tree by the crossroads, said to grow from the grave of a man who married a goat and was blessed with laughter until the day he died. If you walk around it 3 times at dusk, some say you'll hear vows whispered on the breeze. These aren't just tales. They're containers for emotions too complicated to say aloud. Grief, joy, gratitude, madness, love. And when you start telling someone about your vow to Milda, half in jest, half in memory, they don't laugh. They say, like the Milk Sisters, or like the bride who turned to stone waiting for her ox to return. They already know your story, because it's theirs too in some version. Historians still argue whether these myths were born from actual events or collective imagination, but in a way it doesn't matter. The moment a story gets retold with meaning, it becomes real. That's the power of myth. It's not about proving something happened. It's about explaining why it feels like it did. Tonight, you light a candle, not because Milda needs a light, but because you do. Because there's something comforting in tradition, even if it's stitched together from straw and size. You hum a song you don't remember learning. Something about a ribbon. Something about a cow. And when Milda shifts in the stall, pressing her side against the boards as if to say, "I'm here," you whisper. "So am I." It's a quiet morning, the kind where dew clings stubbornly to every leaf, and the world feels made of silken fog. You're brushing Milda's coat when the new steward arrives, all boots and parchment, and an expression like someone's asked him to tax the moon. He's young, eager, full of rules, and holding a list. "I'm here to inspect domestic records," he says, as if this is a thrilling opportunity for both of you. Marriage charters, inheritance contracts, land arrangements, household bonds, livestock rolls, especially livestock. You try not to smirk. He rifles through his bag, pulls out a faded scroll, and begins to read from it like it's a sacred text. In accordance with revised agricultural tenancy codes, all livestock not explicitly designated as property must be reviewed for unusual holdings, ceremonial arrangements, or, and I quote, legacy classifications not aligned with current ecclesiastical definitions of domestic structure. You blink. "Sorry, what?" He clears his throat. "We're looking for married cows." "Ah, so it's come to this. Because even now, centuries after the plague, after the famine, after the donkey with a title and the pig who received last rites, Vestiges remain, odd little clauses and customs still tangled in the roots of modern law. You're standing at the blurred edge where old myths meet bureaucracy. Welcome to Echoes in Modern Law. This is the part of the story most people miss. They think the livestock unions vanished entirely, snuffed out by enlightenment, reason, or one very fed-up bishop. But no, it survived. They always do. You see, medieval law wasn't tidy. It was a patchwork. Royal edicts stitched to village customs, canon law balancing precariously on folklore. So when odd rituals, like animal marriage, worked their way into inheritance disputes or tenancy contracts, they sometimes left legal residue. And residue is sticky. There are documented cases of 17th century lawyers finding themselves baffled by clauses referring to the bonded oxen or the co-tenant sheep. These weren't metaphors. They were echoes, remnants of a time when animals weren't just laborers, but legal personalities in their own right. One property dispute in Devonshire, 1694, hinged on the ownership of a field left to Beatrix, household companion, of bovine extraction. The judge ruled in favor of the tenant who'd married Beatrix's grandmother, citing continuity of stewardship. The opposing lawyer quit law and became a brewer. You think it's over? There's more. In a small corner of Flemish agricultural law, buried beneath a labyrinth of footnotes, exists an entry that states, livestock given spiritual or ceremonial bonds shall not be counted among taxable property unless so designated by the head of household. No one enforces it, but no one removed it either, because law, like superstition, has inertia. Once it rolls downhill, it's hard to stop, especially when no one wants to be the clerk who strikes out ceremonial cow partnerships from the official book. Historians still argue whether these legal leftovers are truly linked to actual marriages or just symbolic livestock listings misread by future generations. But when you peel back the layers, you find language too specific to be accident. Words like bonded companion, sacred assistant, co-residing ox. One 18th century British court case involved a land lease that included the spouse of the milch cow as per spring rights of 1652. No one could agree what that meant, so they ignored it and let the lease continue. That's the thing about legal systems. They're less like marble statues and more like compost heaps. Bits get layered. Rot? Yes, but also grow. So today, when modern agricultural surveys ask about household dependence and someone lists a cow, it raises an eyebrow, but not a scandal. When an old estate lawyer discovers a clause about vow-bound livestock, they don't erase it. They file it under obscure rural tradition and move on. There are even modern pet trusts, legal arrangements allowing animals to inherit money or property. They're dressed in modern language, full of conditions and clauses. But squint a little and you'll see what's really there. An echo of Milda. Because long before courts allowed cats to inherit fortunes, medieval farmers were carving out space for their companions. Not in marble, but in meaning. You glance at the steward now, frowning over your old parchment. What is this? He asks, holding up the faded vow. Just a memory, you say, from before your time. He sniffs, reads it again, and writes something on his clipboard. You peek. No irregular holdings observed. Companion animal only. Only. You look at Milda, at the mark still scratched on the beam above her stall, at the little bundle of dried rosemary hanging beside the door. Only. But that's not quite right. Because even now, even in a world that runs on ink and stamps and logic, some part of your story still survives. In words no one understands. In scrolls no one throws away. In fields that still remember the vows spoken over hooves and breath. And as the steward leaves, boots crunching on frostbitten earth, you whisper under your breath, they'll forget the laws. You pat Milda's side, but not the names. The first frost of autumn is thin and delicate, like the skin of milk left too long in a cup. You crunch across the field, boots leaving dark bruises in white, and Milda follows at her usual pace, slow, deliberate, unconcerned. You reach the ridge overlooking the pasture, and sit beside her, knees pulled to your chest. Below, the village is a quiet scatter of thatch and smoke. You can hear the faint clang of a blacksmith, a dog barking lazily, and somewhere, a flute playing a tune you haven't heard since your first feast as a boy. It hits you all at once how much has changed and how much hasn't. You remember the first time you heard someone joke about marrying their cow. You thought it was nonsense, a lark. But now here you are, 20 years older, one cow wiser, and with a trail of ribbon-wrapped memories behind you. You never signed a church register, never wore a ring, but you lived beside Milda through famine, plague, and loss. You whispered vows by firelight. You protected her name from tax rolls and stewards and storms. And if that's not a kind of marriage, what is? Which brings you to the quiet question you've been circling since this all began. What was love, anyway? For medieval farmers like you, love was never about lace and ballads. It wasn't about chivalry or candlelit promises. Love was survival, shared burdens, worn paths, warmth in winter. You loved what got you through. And for many, that meant a cow, or a pig, or a goat with judgmental eyes, and a tendency to steal cabbage. The word love meant different things depending on who said it. To a monk, it was divine. To a knight, it was glory. To a farmer, it was consistency. Because you didn't need grand gestures. You needed help dragging a plow, warmth against your side, the quiet reassurance that no matter how hard the world pressed, you weren't alone. And so the rituals came, not because you believed cows should wear veils or say vows, but because when the world was too cruel to explain, you wrapped your reality in ceremony. You made a joke of it, a gesture, a ritual. You gave meaning to the one constant in your life. Your beast, your partner, your not wife but still somehow spouse. Historians still argue over the meaning behind these unions. Some see them as satire, others as superstition, others still as rebellion wrapped in wool. But none of them were there. None of them stood in a flooded field, soaked to the bone, and felt the warm muzzle of an ox pressed gently against their shoulder, like a blessing. None of them watched a pig outlive two landlords and become the town mascot. None of them looked into a pair of steady, knowing cow eyes and felt safer than in a church. You did. And that's why the laws never truly understood. That's why the priests stumbled. Because they thought love was one thing. You knew better. Love, for you, was never a wedding. It was weathering. It was every morning you rose to Milda's breath. Every night you lay to the sound of her chewing. It was naming her heir not because she could inherit, but because she deserved to. In the end, it wasn't about marriage. Not really. It was about marking a bond so fierce, so quiet, so utterly necessary that the world had to take notice. Even if only for a moment. Even if only through ribbon or parchment or whispered vows by candlelight. You stroke Milda's side now. Her coat is rough with age, her breathing slower, but her eyes still meet yours with that same unblinking calm. You lean forward, rest your forehead against hers, and say, "Thank you for everything." She doesn't speak. Of course not, but she stays. And that's enough. The stars are out now, spread like quiet lanterns across the dark. The world below is hushed into itself. Fields gone still, barns closed tight, even the wind easing into a gentler kind of breath. You lie back, arms folded beneath your head, and let the quiet settle into your bones. Everything feels softer here, slower. The edges of the story blur, the sharp lines of history melting into the cool comfort of memory. The cow, the vows, the laughter, all of it lingers like the scent of hay after rain. Faint, familiar, soothing. The past, you realize, isn't something you walk away from. It follows you like a loyal beast. Quiet, patient, waiting for the moments when you need to remember who you were, who they were. And maybe that's why we tell these stories. Not to explain, not to argue, but to keep something warm close to our chest. A little absurdity, a little tenderness, a little moo in the madness. You feel your breath slow. You listen to the rhythm of the night. Distant owls creaking wood, the low sigh of a sleeping field. It's all still here, so rest now. You've walked far, dug deep, laughed lightly. You've seen what love looked like when the world was falling apart, and how people found ways to hold on anyway. Let that be enough for tonight. Close your eyes. Let the stars keep watch, and the stories keep whispering. Sleep well, strange soul, sweet dreams.